Welcome to The Last Climb. Today I'll go over when influencers climbed a Himalayan peak on forecasts alone, while a nearby Sherpa team noticed the mountain wasn't behaving as the forecast suggested. The sponsorship deadline and rising trust in forecasts slowly outweighed what the mountain was showing, and warning signs on the route were gradually brushed aside. Once the consequences became clear, it changed how the entire climb is remembered. It was October 11, 2022, when the team reached base camp on Amadablam's southwest approach at approximately 15,400 feet after a 9-day approach from Lukla through Namche Bazaar and Tengboche. By that afternoon, acclimatization rotations had followed schedule, and all 3 members were assessed in good physical condition, with the expedition operationally on track. Iriu Stinson, she was 34. Originally a back-end engineer out in Denver. The kind of person who's used to thinking in systems, like what can fail, what holds up, that sort of thing. But over the last few years, she'd kind of built this online presence around climbing and forecasting. Posting about models, weather systems, this is what the data says versus what actually happens on the mountain, that whole angle. And for this expedition, it wasn't just a private trip for her. It was kind of framed as a live case study she could share with her audience while it was happening. Then there's Wendell Beaumont. She's 29, from Portland, a fitness instructor. She was already posting a lot of high-altitude training stuff online, like her workouts, her climbs, expedition updates, that kind of thing. She wasn't new to climbing at all, but over time it had definitely shifted into something she was also documenting. Not just doing it for herself anymore, more like performance, endurance, progress, and sharing that progression with people watching. And then Jafina Thomas, she's 41, a freelance marketing consultant. But more than that, she'd kind of moved into the whole expedition content and sponsorship space. She was the one who pulled this entire climb together, and she structured it around a very specific timeline. Like, there were deliverables, updates, content deadlines, and a sponsorship window that basically needed a successful summit within a set time frame. So the climb wasn't just a climb, it was also tied to a schedule that had already been promised to other people watching from the outside. That sponsorship clock is always quieter than people think, but I've rarely seen it not influence something somewhere along the line. The 3 met through a closed mountaineering forum in late 2021 and quickly realized there was a shared opportunity beyond just climbing. The expedition was structured not only as a summit attempt, but as a content-driven project, part training narrative, part forecasting experiment, and part sponsored documentation of a guided ascent in the Himalayas. Over 11 months of planning, the climb developed a quiet but constant layer of external expectation, scheduled updates, audience engagement, and the pressure to deliver a successful summit outcome that aligned with the content timeline already committed to sponsors and viewers. Amadablam rises to 22,349 feet in Nepal's Khumbu region, roughly 6 miles southeast of Everest. It is among the most photographed peaks in the Himalaya, yet that visibility often creates a false sense of accessibility. The southwest ridge route is technically demanding, involving mixed rock and ice above Camp 2 at approximately 19,700 feet, a fixed rope system through a critical crux traversed between roughly 21,000 and 21,400 feet, and a long, exposed summit push that leaves little room for error in judgment or timing. A high-pressure system settled over the region, producing unusually warm conditions for October. Daytime temperatures at Camp 2 reached approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to a historical mid-October average of 17 to 19 degrees. While this deviation was not itself an obvious hazard in atmospheric forecasts, it played a key role in altering the physical state of the snowpack in ways that were not visible in standard model outputs. The unusually warm conditions were affecting more than just the temperature. Beneath the surface, older layers of snow were slowly breaking down into loose, grainy crystals that climbers often call sugar snow. At first glance, the slope could still seem stable enough.
It could hold weight under normal conditions, and nothing about it immediately stood out as dangerous. But the layer underneath had become much weaker. If enough stress was placed on it, it could suddenly give way and allow a collapse to spread across the slope. The problem was that none of this would show up in the forecasts Ariu was studying.
Those forecasts could track conditions in the air, wind, temperature, and incoming weather. But from what I've gathered, they couldn't really tell what was going on inside the snowpack itself.
In the 48 hours before the summit attempt, northwest winds began depositing a thin 4 to 6 inch wind slab across the southwest-facing bowl above the crux traverse, building directly over a weak, faceted layer. The bowl's shape sheltered the area from broader forecast readings, so this loading happened in a localized zone. The models couldn't fully capture, creating a buried instability with a solid slab sitting on a weak foundation. At the same time, field signs suggested conditions were shifting faster than expected. On each of the 3 days at base camp, cloud formation along the northeast ridge appeared earlier than usual. Pasang Nuru noted the pattern and felt it pointed to a system evolving ahead of the latest forecast updates. Overnight, the temperatures just weren't really doing that normal freeze-thaw thing they usually do up there. So instead of the snow hardening up into a solid crust by morning, it was still kind of soft when they woke up, like it hadn't fully reset, if that makes sense. And it kept happening. Night after night, it wasn't really locking back into that firm layer you'd expect, just staying a bit loose, a bit unsettled. It was subtle, nothing dramatic on its own. But over time, it basically meant the snowpack wasn't getting that proper reset between cycles, and that little detail was quietly adding to the instability higher up on the mountain. Pasang Nuru was 52 years old, from Namche Bazaar, with 11 Himalayan summits across his career, including 3 on Amadablam. He was the lead Sherpa on the expedition, hired through the same Kathmandu outfitter as the clients. On the afternoon of October 11, while the team organized gear at base camp, he observed the upper mountain as he had for decades, a quiet, habitual practice not tied to any instruments or models. He noted that the temperature inversion above 18,000 feet felt unusual for the season and briefly mentioned that the snowpack seemed different that year. Ariu responded politely and showed him a 10-day model forecast on her tablet. He looked at it without comment. He had seen similar printouts many times before.
I notice he doesn't really react to the screen at all. Just that quiet pause where you can tell he's already weighing what he's seeing against what he's felt on the mountain.
Tendi Sherpa, 31, from Fortsey, was technically skilled and naturally observant, often checking terrain conditions in a quiet, methodical way. Ang Dorje, 44, from Kumjung, had 7 Himalayan summits and a background that moved from load carrying into guiding work. All 3 Sherpas were employed through the outfitter under a standard guided client contract that included a safety refusal clause, allowing them to step back if conditions were judged unsafe. On October 12, the team climbed to Camp 1 at 17,600 feet for an acclimatization rotation before heading back down to base camp without any issues. During the descent, Tendi lingered a bit, checking sections of the fixed line above Camp 1 more out of habit than anything he was asked to do. That evening, he mentioned noticing a deep settling sound in the snowpack higher on the route.
It's the kind of sound I've heard before when a weak layer inside the snow gives way under pressure, and I can't help but think it usually means there's something unstable sitting just underneath.
Pasang acknowledged the report and said they would take a closer look at conditions before making any decision about a summit attempt. On October 13, after a carry to Camp 2, Ariu's forecast showed a stable 6-hour summit window opening at midnight on October 14, with moderate winds near the summit, a cloud base around 21,000 feet, and no expected precipitation. The major models were in agreement. Ariu recorded the window, and Jafina immediately cross-checked it against their content release schedule and sponsor obligations, confirming it aligned with the required summit timeframe. The window wasn't just meteorological, it also matched the narrative arc they had already committed to presenting. That afternoon, The Sherpas went higher without the clients for a final check above Camp 2. What they found confirmed earlier concerns. A 4 to 6 inch wind slab resting on a weak, faceted layer across the southwest bowl above the Crux Traverse. When probed with an axe, the slab collapsed into loose, grainy snow beneath it. Cloud formation along the northeast ridge was also appearing earlier than usual, and the surface gave off a soft, hollow creak underfoot, subtle signs they hadn't seen on this route in prior seasons. They returned to Camp 2 and briefed the team. Pasang said he couldn't recommend a summit attempt for October 14. His point was simple. The forecast described the air, but the problem was in the snow. What followed wasn't really a confrontation. It was a clash between two completely different ways of understanding risk, one grounded in lived experience on the mountain, and the other shaped by data models, audience expectations, and the need to deliver a successful, shareable summit narrative. Iryu kept returning to the forecast agreement and model consistency, while Pasang stayed focused on what the snow was telling him directly. Jafina, meanwhile, kept the timeline in the background of every decision, even when she didn't say it out loud. Wendell chimed in too, saying the conditions reminded her of stuff she'd seen in the Cascades and on Denali, but she also admitted it wasn't quite at this scale. Jafina only brought up the timeline once, pretty quietly, and then dropped it.
That quiet mention of timeline sticks out to me, not because it's loud or forceful, but because it's clearly still sitting in the room, even when nobody wants to lean into it.
Wendell floated the idea of waiting a bit longer, just to let things refreeze overnight and maybe stabilize. But Pasang pushed back on that. He basically said temperature alone wasn't going to fix it. The weak layer underneath was still weak, no matter how cold it got. After that, it just kinda ended. No agreement, no resolution, and later that evening, Pasang formally stepped back through the outfitter, invoking the safety refusal clause, and withdrawing his team from participation in the summit attempt for the following day. The confirmation came in from Kathmandu not long after. After the Sherpas formally stood down, Jafina contacted a 23-year-old named Raju Tamang, who had arrived in the area as a kitchen assistant attached to an adjacent expedition's base camp support staff. Raju was from Tapaljung district, not a certified mountain guide, and had previously reached Camp 3 on Amadablam 2 seasons earlier as a load carrier on a fully staffed commercial expedition. He spoke limited English. Zafina offered him $200 in cash to accompany the team as a fixed-rope assistant and equipment carrier for the summit attempt, and he accepted.
I always pause at decisions like this, not because they're uncommon, but because they tend to happen quickly when fatigue and pressure are already in the room.
The decision to proceed was ultimately collective, but heavily shaped by the overlapping pressures of sponsorship timelines, content expectations, and the belief that the forecast window validated their planned narrative. Even without explicit agreement, the expedition had already been framed as a summit success story in progress, and stepping away at that point would have meant breaking that trajectory. Iryu logged the forecast window one final time at 11:45 that night, and it still showed a stable 6-hour opening. At Camp 2, conditions at departure matched the forecast wind under 10 miles per hour, around 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and clear visibility under partial stars. Nothing in the immediate environment contradicted the decision to leave, highlighting a key limitation of the expedition. Forecasts could describe the air above the mountain, but not the snowpack beneath their feet. The team left Camp 2 shortly after midnight on October 14. The early ascent went smoothly, with steady pacing and the lower fixed lines behaving as expected. Raju handled rope transitions at anchors without issue, and for that stretch the mountain felt consistent with the plan. As they climbed higher and entered the Camp 3 zone near 21,000 feet, the route shifted from a more protected ridge into the exposed southwest-facing bowl of the Crux Traverse. Wind above the ridge turned erratic, brief, calm periods broken by sudden northwest gusts of 35 to 40 miles per hour. That didn't match the forecast profile. Shortly after they moved into the upper section, Aryu's GPS wine meter picked up a mismatch with the forecast. She figured it could just be the terrain messing with things, wind getting funneled and sped up by the shape of the mountain, which happens. She also briefly considered that the weather system itself might be moving faster than the last model update, but without solid real-time data, she didn't really lean into that idea.
I'd probably do the same here. When your instruments start arguing with the terrain, it's easy to blame the terrain first, because that's usually the safer explanation.
Then cloud cover started rolling in from the northeast, which didn't match the southwest system they'd been tracking. And by the time they were approaching the Crux Traverse, the clouds had dropped below Camp 2, completely cutting off their view of the route behind them. At the approach to the Crux Traverse, Wendell led the rope team and noted a distinct change in the snow surface beneath her crampons, a soft, compressible layer unlike anything encountered lower on the route. She paused and reported it. Ariu interpreted it as normal variation across elevation and exposure bands, while Zafhina noted they were roughly within an hour of the summit ridge. Raju remained at the transition anchor approximately 80 feet below, managing a rope change. As the team moved into the first sustained section of the Crux approach, the snow underfoot began to behave inconsistently across short distances. In some steps, crampons cut cleanly into firm, supportable layers, while in others, they dropped several centimeters into unconsolidated material that offered delayed resistance before settling. This variability forced the team to adjust pacing, reducing spacing between climbers and increasing reliance on fixed points rather than direct footing. The changes were subtle enough that no single step was alarming, but the cumulative effect was a growing uncertainty in how the surface would respond under load.
I'm watching that rhythm change in real time. One step is solid enough to trust. The next one you can actually see the boot sink just a little bit before it catches. And that kind of inconsistency forces you to stop climbing on autopilot.
As they continued upward, the terrain steepened gradually across the bowl, forcing longer traverses between fixed anchors. Movement became slower and more deliberate. Each climber was now spending more time weighted on a single foot while searching for secure placements with the other. The process was routine for technical climbing at altitude, but it increased the amount of force being transferred into the snowpack over longer periods of time. Progress remained steady, though noticeably slower than it had been lower on the mountain. Several minutes later, a small amount of surface snow detached from a section above the route and slid downslope in a narrow ribbon no more than a few feet wide. The movement stopped almost immediately and involved too little material to present a direct hazard. Similar sloughs can occur naturally on steep terrain and are not uncommon during summit pushes. Nevertheless, it drew attention because it represented the first visible movement within the snowpack since entering the bowl. The team paused briefly, watched the slope, and observed no additional activity before continuing. Wind conditions continued to fluctuate without establishing any consistent pattern. Short periods of relative calm were interrupted by abrupt gusts that transported loose snow across the surface in thin sheets. In several locations, these gusts exposed older crust layers beneath the newer deposits before covering them again moments later. Visibility remained adequate, but the changing surface texture made it increasingly difficult to distinguish stable terrain from recently loaded sections of the slope. Near the upper part of the traverse, Wendell started noticing something a bit odd. The snow wasn't behaving the same way, even in spots that looked identical. One step would feel solid, then the next would suddenly give way a little under her weight. Nothing dramatic on its own, but it didn't feel uniform, like the structure underneath was just inconsistent across the bowl. A few minutes later, the wind actually dropped out for a short stretch. Everything went quiet, in the way mountains sometimes do. Just crampons on snow, the rope moving through anchors, that kind of sound. They kept going in single file, steady spacing, heading for the next anchor. Nothing in that moment really screamed danger. It was just a bunch of small things adding up. Nothing fully clear yet.
I always pay attention to these sudden quiet spells. Not because they mean anything on their own, but because everyone seems to unconsciously slow down when the noise of the wind just cuts out like that.
At a point shortly before dawn on October 14, a slab released from the southwest-facing bowl above the Crux Traverse. The fracture line ran along the interface between a wind-deposited slab and the underlying faceted sugar snow layer, the same configuration identified during Sherpa reconnaissance the day before. The slab extended across roughly 200 feet of the slope and was approximately 14 inches deep, accelerating rapidly down the face within its first moments of movement. The failure initiated above and slightly to the left of the team's position on the traverse. Ariu was at the uppermost point of the rope system, directly within the primary flow path. The slab reached her before any meaningful reaction was possible, and she was carried several hundred vertical feet downslope before the debris came to rest against a rock band near the lower approach zone. The forces involved and depth of burial were consistent with immediate fatal trauma, with post-incident assessment concluding incapacitation occurred within the initial seconds of movement.
I don't even get a moment to process the scale of it here. It's just how fast the uppermost position on a rope team turns into the most exposed point the second something releases above you.
Wendell was clipped into a fixed anchor right at the edge of the traverse when the slab came through. The anchor started to give under the sudden load, then held, but that snap in tension threw her straight into the rock face beside her. She broke several ribs and her left forearm. She stayed conscious the whole time, but ended up just hanging there in the dark, stuck on the fixed line, no working radio, and really no way to move or get herself out. Jafina was a bit higher and off to the side, partly shielded by a rock rib that took most of the force away from her. She wasn't hit directly, but the powder cloud still swept through this fast, choking mix of ice and air that wiped out visibility in seconds. She dropped a short distance and managed to arrest herself with her ice axe. No major blunt force injuries, but she was still exposed up there in worsening conditions, visibility collapsing around her, breathing thin air in an oxygen-depleted environment, just stuck in it. Raju was lower at the transition anchor, outside the main debris path. The cloud moved through and then cleared. When it did, there was still no response from above. He waited for a short moment, trying to listen or see anything, but there was nothing coming back. So he made the call and started descending on his own. He reached Camp 2 not long after and went straight to alert Pasang. Pasang, Tendi, and Ang Dorje began ascending at first light, which came after a brief pre-dawn window of improving visibility. Wind and cloud conditions on the upper mountains still prevented helicopter operations, forcing a ground-based response as they followed the fixed-line route they knew from decades of combined experience on Ama Dablam. Zafina Thomas was found later that morning about 200 meters below the main debris field on the lower approach, having moved downslope after the event through a mix of limited self-movement and avalanche displacement into a more visible, accessible area for the Sherpa team. Her core temperature was around 82 degrees Fahrenheit, and she had died several hours earlier. There were no signs of blunt force trauma. The cause of death was recorded as hypothermia and environmental exposure, with contributing factors including altitude stress and prolonged cold exposure following the avalanche event. Wendell Beaumont was reached later that morning at approximately 21,100 feet, still suspended from the fixed line where she had been held since the event. She had remained in place for several hours in severe wind chill conditions. A helicopter evacuation was completed later in the day once a narrow weather window opened and wind conditions dropped to survivable limits at altitude, allowing a high-risk extraction. She was transported to Kathmandu with multiple fractures and severe frostbite affecting several fingers, which later required surgical amputation. Ariu Stinson's body was recovered near midday in the debris field at approximately 20,700 feet, partially buried beneath consolidated avalanche debris at the base of the runout zone. The official cause of death was recorded as blunt force trauma with secondary asphyxiation, consistent with high-energy avalanche burial.
I keep thinking about how far down she ended up relative to where it actually broke. That kind of distance tells you just how much force was involved. And once someone is that deep in debris like that, recovery is less about searching and more about tracing the path the mountain already carved.
The official investigation later confirmed that the forecasting system used by the team accurately represented free air atmospheric conditions at summit elevation for the relevant period. However, It also noted that the final wind loading event, which contributed to slab formation, occurred outside the model's last update cycle. The system had arrived earlier than projected, depositing load onto a pre-existing weak faceted layer that had already reached critical instability. The report concluded that the forecast was not incorrect in what it measured, but incomplete in what it could not measure: the snowpack structure beneath the atmospheric data. It also formally documented that the lead Sherpa's refusal had been issued in accordance with established safety protocols, and that the specific concerns recorded the faceted layer, the wind slab loading, and the observed acceleration of system behavior relative to forecast timing corresponded directly with the failure mechanism identified in post-incident analysis.